So once again, I've been talking lately about double-blind placebo-controlled trials in the evaluation of medication and, to the extent that we can do them, in evaluating psychotherapy as well. And the advantage of these trials is that they're really simple. You have two groups. One group gets the real thing, and the other group gets the fake pills or fake therapy, right? And everyone knows they might be getting one or the other, but no one knows, supposedly, which one they're getting. And the people treating and evaluating their progress don't know either. You can see why this is so hard to do with psychotherapy, but it seems initially pretty straightforward with medication because we can easily make fake pills. And I keep saying how elegant these studies are for their sheer simplicity. Hard to do, but their design is really simple. And yet they can still produce problems. So today I'm going to focus on another of these issues, and that's the long-term effects of medication. As simple as they are, most medication trials are actually pretty expensive. And there's a problem that I haven't talked about much. People drop out. They have good intentions. They know they're in a research study. They commit. But let's face it, a lot of us don't want to peg our health on a coin toss that might randomize us to a sugar pill. And in the case of antidepressant research, if you're depressed, you're not at your best. Life is really hard for you right now, and staying organized enough to take your pills, even if they may not be working very well, that's difficult. Plus, most medications have side effects, so people often find that they just can't tolerate the medications anyway. It's a standard thing that physicians prescribe an antidepressant, the person takes it, and who knows why, they get a side effect that most people don't get, or it's way worse for them than usual. So you stop that medication and you try a different one. But in a research study, you don't have that freedom, usually. So long story short, people drop out. And if they drop out more from the medication condition than from the placebo condition, we've got trouble when analyzing the data. Most studies use the idea of intent to treat. So let's say you have 100 people in the medication condition and 100 people in the placebo condition. You try to analyze what happens to those 100 people, regardless of whether they actually kept taking the pills. Well, you can imagine that if a third of your medication group stops taking the pills, it's going to be harder to show that that 100 is doing better at the end than the 100 in the placebo group. Your drug may not be all that powerful, and a chunk of the people in the study aren't even taking it. Waters down the results. It's still a good idea to use intent to treat, because what we really want to know is if we write 100 prescriptions, how many people are actually going to get better. Some won't take it. Some will start and then stop. Some, the drug won't work at all. And some might work great. Terrific. How many? Anyway, this problem and the cost of the study means that if you run the trial for 2 years of treatment, you will A, go bankrupt, and B, relatively few people will still be taking the pills by the end. And mostly what you need to show to regulatory agencies is a short-term effect anyway. So, the result. Most trials of antidepressant medication, and in fact, most psychiatric medications overall, are quite short. They tend to range from 6 to 12 weeks, and outcome is measured at the end of that period. As I've said in other videos, they mostly look at improvement scores from before treatment to after treatment, and they compare those improvements between the drug group and the placebo group. So terrific. But the whole point of these studies is to tell us what's likely to happen in the everyday doctor's office prescribing the medications as directed. And when we're talking about benzodiazepines, which are commonly used anti-anxiety medications like temazepam, lorazepam, clonazepam, alprazolam. Those short trials, they're fine because those medications are only meant to be used over the short term. They tend to become rapidly less effective if you use them long term, and there's the risk of dependence. So we generally do not want to see people taking them for months and months and months, at least not on a regular basis. But what about the antidepressants? We're testing them for, say, 8 to 12 weeks. Is that the usual course of treatment? Well, no, it isn't. Often a person will be prescribed an antidepressant and then monitored for the next few weeks to see if they're showing any response. And if they're not, the drug might be withdrawn and another one will be tried. But if the person can tolerate the drug and it looks like it might be helping, the usual length of treatment is at least 6 months and more often longer. Some people are taking these medications for many years. But again, the tests are usually for a couple of months. So there's an assumption being made. Short-term response tells us what the long-term response is likely to be. So if it controls your depression after 6 weeks, it'll probably keep doing that after a year. Terrific. But will it? That's not a subject for a lot of study. And it's not something that's really looked at when the drug is approved. The approval tends to be based on these very short-term studies, even though that's not how the drug is meant to be used. Now, that sounds like a disaster. We know, for example, that opiate medication like oxycodone actually does help with pain control in the short term. But in the long run, there is a huge problem with addiction, to the point where the long-term risks to the person's life probably outweighs the benefit in pain control in the short term, at least for many patients. Now, antidepressants don't seem to be as problematic as opiates, though they can produce withdrawal effects after long-term use in some patients, and many people find it difficult to come off them. As well, for some patients, the drugs seem to become less effective with time. Behind the scenes, people talk about poop out. The drug seems to be working great, but after a while, it poops out and isn't as effective. How common is that? Well, we don't really know. I certainly see people who have taken the same drug for many years, and either they're well, and they would be well without the drug, or the drug is continuing to work for them. It's not pooping out. Luckily, once a drug gets approval, the research doesn't stop, at least not completely. Some researchers look at longer-term outcomes and complications associated with different medications. And in some cases, the FDA issues approval of a medication, but mandates that certain post-approval trials shall be done to see what happens long-term. In this vlog, I don't want to be an alarmist about medication. I see lots of people who seem to have benefited from pharmacological intervention. And if we can fine-tune the science to give us even better treatments that work faster and longer with fewer side effects and no withdrawal syndrome, believe me, I'd be thrilled. But it does seem odd that we test a class of medications by using them in a way that few people would ever do in clinical practice. The whole point of drug testing is to predict what happens in clinical use. If you're not testing regular clinical use, how valuable is that data? It's a bit like testing a screwdriver on screws and then saying, well, it'll probably work on nails too. Well, maybe, and maybe not. We'd need to look. If you like some of these ideas, my book, How to Be Miserable, 40 Strategies You Already Use, is available from any bookseller, online or in person.